Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the fifth round game here in the FIDE Canada's chess tournament, which is being held in Toronto, Canada. Now, after a nice rest day yesterday, we get back to the grind. First half, or first quarter, I should say, did not go as well as I would have liked. I lost one game alongside 3 draws, which is certainly not what I was hoping for. But the rest day yesterday and being able to start over fresh, today I went in with the approach of simply trying to play good chess and see what happens. Now, my opponent today was Alireza Firouzja, representing France, who is originally from Iran. Very, very talented junior player. Now, he's a player who a couple of years ago, Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion, more or less anointed him as being the next great superstar who's going to take over the game of chess. Unfortunately, things have not really panned out in that direction for Alireza since then, but nonetheless, with such things in his mind, a lot of people talking about hype around him, I knew that Alireza would be feeling a lot of pressure today because the last candidates which he played in 2022 was not a great result for him. This tournament also not starting off great with a loss in round 2 against Nepo, and I knew that he would try to bring the heat. So let's jump right into the action. So the game starts with e4, and now I play the move e5, knight f3, knight c6, and Alireza plays the classic Gucci piano with bishop to c4. Game continues with knight f6, d3, bishop c5, c3, and now I play h6. Now, this probably is going to remind you guys of the recap I did for round number 4 on my game, which I drew against Ramesh Babu Praggnanandh, ha 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 ha. Now, in that game, Prag also played an early h6 against me to stop white from playing bishop g5, and that's one of the reasons that I played it today. Now, obviously, the game against Prag was a Spanish, so the bishop was on b5, for example, in the position where he played h6 and knight f6, but nonetheless, the Italian and the Spanish have a lot of similarities here. It's just a matter of where the white bishop is, whether it's on c4 or b5. So I go h6 to stop bishop g5, which would pin the knight, and now the game continues with b4. I go bishop e7, and now we get the move queen to b3. Here I castle, trying to guard the pawn on f7 from being captured. Now, it's worth pointing out that in the women's event, there actually was a game that was very similar to this between, I believe, Vaishali and Humpy Knaru in the first round, which also had the same opening with the early b4 and bishop to e7. So queen b3 castle is played. Alireza goes a4, trying to take more space on the queen side. Now I play d6, protecting the pawn on e5 and also opening up the scope for the light square b. Knight bd2 is played, and now I play the move knight b8. Now, knight b8 might look like an unusual move, and this is one of these moments where in the video I tell you guys that this is where it's a professional chess player. Do not try the stunt at home. Now, the reason I say that is because knight b8 is a very strange move. I'm retreating the knight. You guys who watch my videos probably think, well, you develop your pieces. Why not go bishop g4 or bishop d7 or something? But you put the knight on b8 to retreat. What is this? You're setting up the piece to move again as though it's your game against Vida. Now, the reason that I played knight b8 is very simple. What I would like to do is build the classic big black center with c6 and d5, putting a lot of pressure on this bishop on c4. Now, with the knight on c6 here, I am unable to push d5, so that's why I retreat. Also, in some variations of the Spanish, there are situations where you retreat the knight and then put it on the d7 square, such as the Breyer system within the Ruy Lopez. So after knight b8, Alireza plays d4, and now I take after a long think. Now, I was already sort of out of my preparation around this point in time, and I really was unsure whether to play knight b8 or a5 first. Like, I could have tried to go a5, b5, knight b8, and reach this position after d4. Anyway, I play knight b8, d4, takes, and now I go a5 anyway, and here Alireza plays the move e5. Now, if Alireza had played b5 here, my intention was to sack a pawn with d5, and after takes and knight bd7, castles, and knight b6, the pawns here on d4 and d5 are a little bit weak. D's knights are jumping towards the center, and I didn't think I had any issues in the position. So, Alireza plays e5, and now I go knight h5. Worth pointing out that knight d7 here would actually... Oh, I thought this would be a very bad move. Maybe not. I was a little bit worried about bishop takes pawn, sacking the bishop. Oh, but after takes e6, there's rook f3, which, of course, I completely missed during the game. That is a slight mistake, and that is why I didn't play knight d7. So I play knight h5 here. Knight d7 probably is acceptable if this isn't playable, but the computer does think knight h5 is actually the best move, so I put the knight on the rim. So what's going on? You guys are saying, wait, so first of all, I went knight b8. I underdeveloped a knight, and now I'm also putting my knight on the rim here, and white has the big center. But as the famous chess philosopher Levon Aronian once said many years ago, when your opponent is pushing your pawns forwards, pawns cannot go backwards. So white is pushing all this p here in the center of the board and on the wing, but the pawns can't go backwards. So it's very, very provocative, trying to get white to overextend very early. So after knight h5, we get b5, and now I play knight to f4 here, putting pressure on the pawn on g2. Alireza plays g3, and now I go d5. Now, this is a very important move because I'm closing down the center of the board with d5, so this bishop no longer has any scope on the diagonal. Alireza plays bishop f1, which is a move I expected. He could have taken the knight and been up a pawn temporarily, but such a position like this looks horrible for white. White can maybe try rook g1, but after takes, and queen d4, black is probably very much in the game here, especially with the white king not being developed. And if white were to play a move like castles, which is the computer move, after queen to d5, I think that black should be fine. Computer still prefers white after knight d2, but this is 3,500 level chess, and Alireza and I are not 3,500s. We're mere 2,800 level players. So the game continues with bishop f1, and now I play knight e6. Now, the funny thing about this position is I did briefly consider this very strange move, knight to h3 here, and I ended up not playing it, but there is some merit. After white goes bishop g2 and I play c6, you'll notice that white cannot castle the king. The knight covers the g1 square, and the bishop guards the knight. Now, again, without knowing this is a move, this is 3,500 level chess. This is something that I would never seriously consider because this knight on the rim looks very, very weirdly placed, and it simply doesn't feel very human or very natural. Nonetheless, it is the best way to play the position. So I go knight to e6, bishop g2, c6, castles, knight d7, Alireza plays bishop b2, I go knight b6, we get the trade, and now he plays bishop c3. Now what's happened here is both sides have finally completed their development, both sides have castled their kings, they've developed their pieces, and we're in the middle game. Now I thought here I was actually a little bit better because these knights, I feel, are very well placed. The knight on e6 always pressures the pawn on d4, knight on b6 can jump to c4 or a4 potentially, and I just was under the impression that I should be a little bit better here. Game continues with c5, rook b1, and I go rook to a6 here. And the reason I thought I was better in this position is that here, you'll notice white has his pawn on e5 versus the pawn on d5, but this pawn is blockaded. This pawn cannot go forward, but I can push my pawn forward down the road. And when you combine that with this weakness on a4, I felt like I should be a little bit better. So we get queen b5, I go queen c7 here. Alireza plays rook to c1, guarding the bishop. If you play a quiet move like h3, I don't know if this is actually right, but one of the ideas is to sack the bishop and take this bishop on c3. So rook c1 is played, and now I go queen to a7 here, the idea being that I guard this rook, and I also want to go bishop d7. I would love to put my bishop here and kick the queen away, but uh-oh, spaghetti-o, I lose the rook and the game. So here I go queen to a7, guarding the rook, preparing to play bishop d7, and also lining up some threats on the long diagonal towards the white king on g1. Alireza plays queen to e2, guarding the pawn on f2, and now I play bishop d7. Bishop f1 is played, targeting the rook on a6, and now I go knight c4, avoiding hanging the rook on a6, but also opening up the long diagonal for the classic battery with the bishop and the queen. Alireza plays knight b3, and now I play his move bishop b6. Now, this is a move that was very tricky for me to play here. Initially, I wanted to play the move bishop to b4, but I thought after queen to d1, the game was simplifying here. I don't think I'm worse after queen b7, but a lot of trades are going to happen in the center of the board, and most likely the game will be a draw. So when I didn't see a direct reason that bishop b6 is losing, I played this move to try and keep pieces on the board, to try and keep the game going, and hoping that something would happen. So here Alireza plays rook d1, and now I play queen to a8, guarding the pawn on d5. Now the computer, of course, does not like this move. It actually wants me to play queen to b7 here, guarding the pawn and retreating the rook back to a8. At any rate, I'm not a computer. I play queen to a8, we get bishop to g2, and now I play this move knight c5. Now this is a move that was a very nervy move that I played here. One thing we have not really spoken about in these recaps is the time control. Now the players have 2 hours for 40 moves, but there is 0 increment. So what that means, you guys, is no time is added until you reach move 40. And additionally, you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? The big deal is that it really changes the flow of the game. The moves that you play and the time usage has to be a little bit different. So here, for example, I have 21 minutes, Alireza at 16 minutes, but we're only on move 29. And as a general rule, I would say if players get down to like 1 minute or less and you have to make 3 or 4 moves with no increment, and it's not a straightforward endgame or something simple, it's going to be very, very difficult. There's a very good chance you're just going to make a blunder and lose the game immediately. So the flow of the moves really changes a lot if you get low on time, the way that Alireza and I were already starting to end up in. So I go knight c5 here. Alireza trades. The reason I played knight c5 here is I'm worried. This pawn on d5 is weak here. White can play knight d4. And when I go knight c5, I'm simply able to trade off a set of horses here. And it's one less piece for Alireza to use to try and attack me. Additionally, I think my moves here become a little bit easier because after he plays knight h4, I go knight to b6, guarding the pawn on d5 from being captured by the bishop or the rook. But more importantly, I pressure the pawn on a4 at the same time. Alireza plays bishop to d4 here, and now I trade, and I go rook to a7. Now, one thing that I've also spoken about in videos, not so much in these recaps as well, is what we call reactionary moves. When you're playing with 1 or 2 second increment or no increment at all, generally speaking, if you're quite a ways off from the time control, if you have reactionary moves, it's a lot easier to play than if you have to come up with the plan. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that in this position, my moves are very easy. I'm pressuring the pawn on a4 and I'm guarding the pawn on d5. But more than that, I simply want to go for a classic double stack on the c file, put the rook on c1 or c2, and then come up with a plan. So my idea is very easy. I just want to stack the towers and then figure it out in a couple of moves down the road. But for Alireza, he's not in the same situation because he has to worry about the pawn on a4. The pawn on d5, he's trying to maybe win it, but he also has to figure out, does he start pushing p on the king side? So Alireza has like 3 or 4 different ideas. He has to figure out which one works, and my reaction to it is going to be the same pretty much no matter what, with some sort of stack on the open file. So h3 rook c7 is played. Alireza goes g4 here, and now I play the move queen c8. Now I spent quite a bit of time here. You'll notice that I built up about a 10-minute advantage on the clock, but I simply didn't like other moves besides queen c8. Now the reason I play this move more than simply stacking on the file is temporarily I stop white from putting the horse on f5 because I will simply win a pawn. So Alireza goes queen to d2, and now I play rook to c5. Another very nice reactionary move because I simply guard both of these pawns at the same time while keeping an eye on the open file. So now Alireza plays the move queen f4, and I play this move rook to e8. Now, at first I thought Alireza might have made a huge blunder here because I do have this move g5, forking the queen and the horse. But after queen to f6 here, white is pressuring the knight on b6, and if I go rook c6, there's knight to f5. And let's just say I were to play knight c4, there's a classic family fork with knight e7, forking the queen, the rook, and the king at the same time. And if I were to take the queen here, there's check, king h7, knight takes queen, and both the rook and the knight are under attack here, and white is actually close to winning. So I spent quite a bit of time, but ultimately I played the move rook e8 after about 7 minutes, and this is a move that I'm very proud of. I think it was a very, very good move here, very practical, very pragmatic to try and put pressure on this pawn. Alireza plays the move knight f5, we swap, and now I go queen c7, and here he plays the move rook to e1. Now, what you'll also notice is even though Alireza had about a minute and a half, he was playing these last couple of moves very quickly, and this is why the time control is really, really important because you simply cannot get down to seconds on the clock, so you have to make these quicker decisions, and sometimes they're mistakes. So the game continues with rook e1, I go knight d7, and now Alireza plays a very, very peculiar move e6. Now, this is a move that I did not understand at all. I was expecting to play bishop takes d5, and after rook takes e5, there are a couple ways for white to play. I think one of the simplest ways is take, and after take, probably the game should end in a draw with the classic yo-yo with the queen checking back and forth on e6 and c8. At any rate, after knight d7, Alireza plays e6, I trade the queens, and now I go knight f6. Now, after Alireza played rook d4, he did offer me a draw here, but I simply declined the draw because after king to f8, only black can be better. This pawn on e6 is a little bit weak. The pawn on d5 is nicely guarded. If I can bring the king to the center and activate the rooks on the open file, I figure only black can win. So Alireza goes rook d2. We swap the pawns. I bring the king to e7, blockading this pawn, and now he plays rook b2. I go rook c8, anticipating that if he plays rook b7, I can simply block with rook c7. The game continues with bishop f1, and now I play this move knight to e4, bishop to d3, and here I play this move knight c3. Now, this was a huge mistake here. I used 8 minutes before playing it, but in this position, there were 3 moves that I considered. The first one, and this was my initial thought, was rook c1, but after rook b7 check, king takes, and rook b1, guarding the rook on e1. After takes, king f6, takes and rook e8, f3, takes. Computer gives black an advantage in this position after rook e6, but in a rook and pawn endgame here with the same number of pawns, I think this should be a draw, at least in human practice. In a computer game, maybe a computer can win. Actually, it would be a draw in a computer game too, but I feel like it's almost impossible to create winning chances. So then I thought, why not knight d6? I stop rook to b7. I also stop rook to b5 here with the knight covering the squares. and down the road, I want to play something like rook c1. Now, this would have been the right move to play here, and the reason for that is because the third line, which I consider, which was knight c3, I simply missed the next move of my opponent, or I should say the idea behind the next move, which was to play f4. Now, I thought here that Alireza would have to play something like, let's say, rook to b7, rook c7, sorry, not rook there, this rook to c7, and something like rook to b2 here, and try to defend this position after knight a4 and rook a2, and knight c5 and something like bishop c2. But the reason that this was such a mistake by me going knight c3 is there's this move f4, which creates this massive threat of rook to g2, going after the pawn on g7, and because this pawn is on h6 too, white is threatening to win some pawns. So let's say I take a4, rook g2 is played. Probably I can still force a draw after g5, but after f5 or even fg, hg, and rook g5, game should, or maybe it doesn't end in a draw. Maybe I'm supposed to go rook c1 here first, and the show goes on. But at any rate, there's no chance to win the game. Now, to add insult to injury with the knight on c3, I cannot go rook c1. I've closed the file, so there's no trade of the rooks, and I can't capture the pawn on a4. And already here, I was very, very unhappy with what's going on because I knew that any chance of winning the game was simply gone. So I play d4 here, Alireza goes rook g2, and now I play g5, and Alireza plays f5. Now, this move took me very much by surprise here, because I figured after Alireza had defended what was a much worse position, it felt like, where he was the only one who could lose the game, he now goes all in trying to win. Of course, Alireza could simply trade the pawns on g5, go rook to e5 here, knight a4, let's just say takes, knight c5, bishop f5, and the game should end in a draw after d3, takes, and rook g5. Probably will end up with the classic king, rook, and knight versus king and rook, and theoretically, this is a well-known draw. Instead, Alireza plays f5, and now all bets are completely off, and the game is very much spiraling out of control once again, as I have to play knight d5, and now he goes rook e4. Now here, I played this move knight to b4 after quite a bit of a think, and this was my way of effectively offering Alireza a draw. I could have played knight f4. Computer says that after takes, rook g7, and king d6, black is somehow winning here in these complications, but it's very, very scary with white pushing p, bishop b5, rook d8, and for a mere 2800 level player like myself, and after playing for 6 hours, I should say as well, I simply did not want to go into this because if I make one wrong move, I'm going to lose the game. And I wasn't even sure if I was actually winning, which the computer thinks I am, but it's only because after king f6, bishop b5, there's this quiet move d3 here, pushing p and distracting white from trying to push his own e-pawn up the board. So I played knight b4, and now Alireza played f6, which also kind of took me by surprise. I thought he was going to take on d4, and after takes, rook e2, and rook c7, both sides have the same number of pawns on the board, and after king g2, this should simply be a draw. But Alireza goes for glory with f6 here, and now I have to take the pawn. Game continues with rook to f2, rook f5, we get the trade, and now he plays e7. I take the bishop, he queens, I trade, and now I play this move knight f4 after a bit of a think. Now, initially, when I was calculating this line all the way back on knight b4, I saw this position that we had in the game here, and I was going to go knight to b2, and the reason that this is a draw is if white goes rook to a8, I have d3, I'm threatening to push p down the board very, very quickly. If white takes, after king e4, rook a8, and d2, I'm simply winning the game here, because after rook to e8, I go king f3, rook to d8, I queen the pawn, we get takes, a5, knight c3, a6, and knight b5, stopping the white pawn from reaching the end of the board. So I saw this and I was going to go knight b2. I thought king f2, knight a4, rook a8, knight c3, something like takes and king f4, and the game will probably end in a draw after rook to a8 down the road. Many different ways to draw this, but eventually what's probably going to happen is something like d3, check, king e4, check, king f4, rook f8, and some kind of repetition. If you go king d4, white can again check on d8, and after knight d5, now probably king e1 and king d2, or rook to h8, winning the pawn on h6. And the game will be a draw. I don't have a specific line in mind, but it will be a draw. At any rate, I did notice during the game, sort of at the last second, that I had an alternative to knight to b2, which is the move I played in the game, knight to f4. Now, this move definitely came as a huge shock to Alireza, because I think he saw knight b2, thought it was going to be a draw, the game is over, and as soon as I go knight f4, the game gets very, very chaotic and tricky again, because instead of going for the pawn on a4, I'm trying to use my central pawn, but I'm also trying to win and use what we call the classic wide p-pose to push p up the board and win the game. So for Alireza here, this had to have come as a big surprise because it's very upsetting when you think the game is over and suddenly you realize that it's very, very tricky still. So he goes king f1, important move by the way, because if he goes rook a8, this is actually close to losing after d3. If white goes king f2 here, Actually, king f2 might still be a draw, but let's say white takes, for example. After king to e4, if you go king f2, I have d2, and the knight covers the square. The king cannot get over. You get a queen, and you win the game. If white goes rook to a8 here, you have d2, check, king d4, check, and now there's knight to d5, building the classic shield. And again, I'm pushing p, getting a queen, and winning the game. So he goes king to f1, and now I play d3, king f2, and now I take on h3. He goes king e3, and I play this move g4. Now, what I meant by being very tricky or very upsetting is that Alireza was expecting knight b2 and knight a4 where it's an easy draw. But now suddenly the game has transformed completely to where I have these wide peepos on the g and the d file. I'm trying to push the split pawns and win the game. And there's no straightforward forced drawing line in this position. And now Alireza makes a huge mistake with the move king takes d3. Now, as you can tell from the clock, I don't know if it's completely correct, but Alireza had over a minute here, and he got down to 1 second before he played the losing move king takes d3. Now, after rook to a8, the game is still probably drawn, because after g3, he does not take this pawn, by the way, because now king g4 would be winning, because after rook to a8, there's g2, rook g8, knight g5, creating a shield, king f2, and now I start moving the king up with king h3, followed by king to h2, and g1 queen. White can't do anything about it. If you go king g1, I push the other pawn, and now white has to go rook d8 to stop this one from queening, but I have knight to f3, king f2, and I make a queen and win the game. So Alireza spends all his time here. I think he just simply couldn't figure it out, and then he just panics with like 3 seconds on the clock, and he plays this move king takes d3, which just loses on the spot to this move g3. Because now if white plays rook to g8, I don't have to create the shield, although even the shield here would be very, very tricky, by the way, because I'm, again, pushing both these pawns up the board. Computer says the draw, but even this is very tricky. Luckily, I don't have to go for this, as I can simply push the pawn to g2 here. I'm threatening the queen as the knight covers the square. If white goes king c4, queen takes, king b5. White is simply way too slow. The h pawn wins the day here, as my pawn simply gets up the board very, very quickly. And now I go queen to a8 and win the game. And after g2, if white takes on g2, I have knight to f4, forking the king and the rook and winning the game as well. So after g3, Alireza plays rook f8. Now I go king to e6. And here, Alireza Firouzja resigns the game. He could have continued with rook g8, g2, and played on a few more moves, but it would have been to no avail. And if he plays rook h8, which is the other tricky move, I go g2, takes, king f7, covering the square. And after check king g8, he can't stop me from getting a queen. And after rook h3 queen, white can again play on for more moves, but this is not a fortress, and black should win, as the queen is worth 9 and the rook is worth 5. So after king to e6 here, Alireza resigns the game. I get my first win in the 2024 candidates with the black pieces in round number 5. Very, very big win. Certainly gives me some hope to try and mount a comeback, to try and play for first place. We'll see if it's realistic or not. But at any rate, I do get a big win here. But, you know, I think more than getting the win, I do want to point out a couple of things, which is you have to remember that in events like this, or events in general, whatever you might be spending your life on, you have to try and stay positive about the situation. I do firmly believe that in life, everything happens for a reason. And throughout the first couple of days, and even just going into today, it's like trying to stay positive, trying to focus on what matters. And I said this in the post-game interview, and I'll say it once again because I think it's very fitting, but I was watching some videos, just motivational things over the last couple of days in between the 4th and 5th round. And there was one video that I watched featuring the famous, I want to say, motivational speaker, self-help guru, whatever you want to call him, Tony Robbins. And in the video I watched, he made this very succinct point that success without enjoyment is the ultimate failure, or something along these lines. I might have paraphrased slightly wrong. But you know, with this event, and specifically with today, I wanted to go into the game. I wanted to try and enjoy it and just simply play my best and see what happens. And things did work out. So trying to stay positive, trying to build upon today. Tomorrow I will be playing with the black piece, second black game in a row against D. Gukesh, who did win his game. He is now tied for the lead alongside Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia. They're both about 1 point ahead of me right now. But as I've said many times as well, this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. There are still 9 rounds, so anything can happen. But today definitely erases the sort of the bad taste that was in my mouth from the second round, and we just keep moving forward. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. If you are not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below. And we'll be back tomorrow with a recap after my 6th round game here in the FIDE Canada's Chess Tournament in Toronto, Canada. See you guys. Bye.